Chapter 6. Emily was indeed the star attraction of the carnival. People who couldn't afford to spend money at the sideshows would still bring their children back night after night to laugh at the antics of the clown they called Bongo. They never heard the clown speak, words didn't matter. The fun lay in seeing the tall figure sprawl at the slightest impact of a tree, a chair, another person, of seeing the dull-witted bewilderment with which the clown got out of one troubled situation into another. The Bleegans and Edward C. scampered around Bongo, teasing and tormenting, luring him into trouble and then pretending to pummel and pinch him to punish his stupidity. The kids loved it because, as Emily explained to me, they saw Edward C. and the Bleegans as being little like themselves, and seeing a grown-up clown outwitted by the childish-looking dwarf men was not only funny, but satisfying to the young. Personally, I could have clouded the little monsters, and I told Emily so, but she only smiled and asked me to think of the clowns I had once laughed at and to remember what it was that made me laugh. She was right. I had been a little monster too. I had been gleeful when the silly clown fell flat or was punished for being stupid, but that was long before I knew a clown named Emily. Each day's work was long and strenuous for her. She was on the grounds constantly, mingling with the crowds, bumping and tumbling in a continuous effort to win a few laughs from people who were not too ready for laughter. At closing time, she would gather her 3 sleeping children from Pete Harris's tent and would walk wearily outside the gates and over to the boxcar which was their home. She nearly always stopped beside my piano to say good night. I would wait for her there if my chores were finished first. Emily's good night came to be a small spot of joy for me in a day that was often tedious and monotonous. She always ate breakfast with us before she put her makeup on for the day. After that, I seldom saw her except at a distance, during working hours. But there were a few times when the crowds were nearly gone and the lights dimmed that Emily had a chance to stand beside my piano and listen as I played the way I wanted to play. Then I would improvise some of the melodies that were in my mind, trying out variations in minor keys, softly, and with a tenderness that was all for her. Eventually, I'd return to the original major key with a lot of fanfare, which was my way of boasting to her of my skill. Mostly, she would just stand and listen, smiling to herself, but saying nothing. One night, though, she leaned forward and spoke to me softly. "You have a gift, Josh. Don't let these times make you lose sight of it." I was restless during these weeks. Joey and I kept waiting for Lonnie to return, and when he didn't, we knew that he must have lost his job, as he had feared. I took $3 out of the precious 10 that Pete Harris had given me after my first 2 weeks of work, and put them in a letter to Lonnie. Joey added $1 of the money he had earned at running errands, and we wrote Lonnie that this was for the first installment on the money we owed him. We felt good when we mailed that letter. We bought one another gifts for Christmas and were so excited about buying something other than food that we opened our packages days before Christmas arrived. I bought a bright blue shirt for Joey with a chocolate bar slit in the breast pocket, and he gave me an imitation leather wallet to hold my newly acquired wealth. I don't know when a gift had ever pleased me so much. That wallet gave me a sense of well-being when I put it in my hip pocket. Moreover, it had several interesting compartments as well as an identification card, which I filled out proudly. There was a line which stated, "In case of accident, please notify." I started to write Stefan Grondowski on that line. Then I thought better of it, and I wrote Lon Bromer and added the Omaha address he'd given us. Still, in spite of the unforgiving streak in me, I kept thinking of home as Christmas drew near. On the warm, gentle nights when the noise of the carnival had subsided, I would often take long walks, wondering as I walked if there were still the lines of men in front of employment offices back in Chicago, wondering if Kitty had managed to get a job, wondering 100 things about Mom. When Joey wrote a note home to tell them of my job, to let them know that we were well, I gave him $1 to add to the one he was placing in the letter. Joey wrote, "Josh and I are sending you this money for Christmas." He asked me if I wanted to sign the letter, and for a moment, I really wanted to write my name beside his. But I said, "No, I guess not," and he sealed the letter without saying anything more about it. I thought a great deal about Emily during these days, not the Emily who clowned all day, but the Emily who met us at breakfast and stopped beside my piano late at night. The beautiful Emily with great purple eyes and a sweet oval face above the clown's ruff. They were sad, these thoughts of Emily. Somewhere I had gained the impression that love makes one happy, but that was not true for me. Love only hurt me. It hurt the way uncertainty and hopelessness did. One night, as I waited for her to come past my piano and say good night, I heard her youngest boy wailing sleepily as she herded the three of them home. When I saw her stoop to lift the boy in her arms, I ran to her and offered to carry him piggyback to the boxcar. He whimpered at first, and then he let his head droop to my neck, where he sighed and went back to sleep. Emily walked beside me, hand in hand with the other two boys, and none of us spoke as we picked our way along the railroad ties that led up to their home. When we laid the children on their beds, I stepped outside and Emily followed me. She sat down on the lowest step of the car, pulling the skullcap from her bright hair. "Sit down for a minute, Josh," she said. "I've been wanting to talk to you." She paused, looking at me directly. "Is something troubling you lately?" "No," I said, "just the blues." "It's a time for the blues, isn't it? I ought to be thankful that I have a job. Well, I am. It's just—" I didn't know how to finish the sentence. "You're lonely, Josh. I've realized that. It's too bad that there aren't any young people of your age in the carnival. I've been wishing I knew some nice girl, someone you'd enjoy taking to a movie now and then." I shook my head. We both sat silent and stared out into the night for a while. Then, before I knew what I was going to say, I blurted out what was pent up inside me. "I wish you were a girl, Emily. I'd give anything in the world if you were a girl my age." As soon as the words were out, I grew rigid with dismay at what I had revealed. She looked down at the long, flapping shoes of her clown costume for a few moments. Then she turned to me and smiled. "If I were a girl your age, I'd be very proud to know you cared for me, Josh." "But you don't like that I care for you now, do you?" She leaned forward and clasped her hands around her knees. Her face was very sober, and there was a slight frown between her eyes. "You know, Josh, there are women who become very vain when a younger man tells them what you've told me. I'm not vain. I think I'm grateful. It's right to be grateful for every bit of honest affection that comes one's way, isn't it?" "I was afraid you'd think I was a fool," I muttered. "Then you don't know me very well. I think of you as a sensitive, talented boy, a bit on the stubborn side, but never a fool." She leaned toward me. I think she started to kiss my cheek, but she changed her mind and offered me her hand instead. Then she laid her left hand over mine and made the handshake a little caress. I didn't want to leave her, but I knew I must. When I got to my feet, I stood looking down at her for a minute, and she smiled at me. It was a smile, I realized, such as she so often gave to Joey. "Good night, dear Josh," she said. "Good night, and thank you." The next morning at breakfast, Emily turned to Edward C. "I think we must all drag ourselves out of the blues for Christmas. Edward C., the carnival will be closed Christmas Eve, so why don't you and the boys come over to my place for cocoa and molasses cookies? Would you like that?" I suppose our faces showed our delight. "It's an honor, Josh," Edward C. told me later. "Emily keeps so much to herself. I can't remember a time when she has invited any of us to her home. It's obvious that you and Joey and I are special to her." We began immediately to think of a gift which we might take to her on Christmas Eve. Joey thought a box of candy would be right. I wanted to buy something more feminine, more personal. There were pretty bottles of perfume at one of the concessions. I very much wanted to buy perfume for Emily, but Edward C. was sternly practical. "She needs money, so much, Josh. With that family of growing boys, I think we should find a bright box and fill it with dimes, 10 dimes from each of us. Joey can polish them until they're shiny, and we'll get one of the ladies to tie a ribbon around the box for us. Emily will appreciate it, boys. Believe me, I know she'll appreciate it at this time more than she would either candy or perfume." And so we followed his advice, and the small box of silver did look like a very nice gift. It was not what I really wanted to give Emily, but I had to admit that Edward C. was probably wise in his suggestion. Emily would have very little occasion to wear perfume. I hoped, though, that a day might come when I could buy her something lovely, something right for a beautiful woman. The three of us, well scrubbed and brushed, went over to Emily's boxcar home early the evening before Christmas. She met us at the door, and for the first time I saw her dressed like a woman with no hint of the clown about her. She wore a cotton dress, the colors of which were faded, probably from many washings, but a lovely dress for all of that, with a full skirt that swayed gracefully when she walked. But it was her earrings that made Emily look like a queen. Large, bright hoops that were much the same red gold color as her hair. They swung against her cheeks, catching the light and looking very gay and splendid. Edward C. and Joey found words more easily than I did. They told her how beautiful she looked, how nice it was to see her in a dress instead of a clown's costume, how beautiful her earrings were. She smiled and stooped to kiss each of them on the forehead. Then she looked at me as if she were waiting for what I had to say. "You look very nice, Emily," I told her, and she said, "Thank you, Josh," and kissed me too. Then suddenly the evening was no longer wonderful for me. We stepped inside, and there at the table with her youngest boy on his lap and the other two beside him sat Pete Harris, short and fat and glistening a little, but looking relaxed and pleased. "Hello, hello, gentlemen," he called out in his raspy voice. "How are you, Edward C.? Bought your boys with you, huh? Just look at young sport here. You're getting fat, boy. You're getting some meat on you." He poked Joey in the stomach and then held out his hand to me. "How are you doing, Pedorowski?" he asked. Emily stood beside his chair, smiling and looking happy. "Pete surprised us with roast chickens and pralines. Now we can have a real Christmas party, Joey. The boys could hardly wait until you got here." Joey was beaming. He handed her the box of dimes. "This is for you, Emily, from Edward C. and Josh and me," he said. Emily opened the package, her eyes shining at first and then filling with tears. She held the box of dimes over for Pete Harris to see. He nodded approvingly. "That's a real fine present, boys," he said. Then he looked up at Emily. "You couldn't ask for a nicer one, could you, Hun?" He called her Hun. He spoke to my beautiful Emily as if she belonged to him. And in the next moment she was saying that the dimes from us and the earrings from Pete were making this the happiest Christmas she had known in a long time. And so Pete Harris had given her the earrings that made her look like a queen. And I, who wanted to give her something lovely and feminine, had been persuaded to share in a gift of dimes that would probably be used to buy grits and oatmeal for her boys. I think Edward C. saw the look of disappointment on my face, for he hurried to make an explanation to Emily. "You know, my dear, Josh wanted to buy you perfume, and you're so lovely tonight that I'm sorry I dissuaded him. You should have had gifts that were more personal, gifts that would have allowed us to tell you how pretty you are." She put her arm around the little man's shoulders, but she looked at me when she spoke. "No, Edward C., you three couldn't have given me a finer gift than the box of dimes. And every time I use some of them for food or medicine, I'll say, 'This is my gift of white gloves from Joey. This is a lace handkerchief from Edward C. And this is another drop of French perfume from our musician, from Josh.'" Her words helped a little. Not much, but a little. It would have been better if Pete Harris had kept quiet, but he didn't. He said, "You are on the right track, Edward C. Emily needs those dimes. This ain't a year for lace handkerchiefs and perfume, right, Hun?" But it was a year for earrings from Pete Harris. It was a long, unhappy evening. There was food and laughter. There was a moment when Pete Harris disappeared and returned a few minutes later wearing a mask and white beard, bringing small toys to Emily's children and a last-minute gift for Joey, a pocket knife, obviously an old one with Pete Harris's initials carved in the bone handle, but a gift which nonetheless brought considerable joy to Joey. Later, all of us went across the carnival grounds and gathered around my piano. While I played the old carols, the others sang, and the music under the quiet sky was beautiful. Emily and her boys with Edward C. sang some of the carols in the Cajun tongue, and they sounded sweet and strange, a little mysterious. It should have been a beautiful evening, but it wasn't for me. I was glad when I could get away and be alone. And the days that followed, I was edgy and unhappy. Joey noticed it and stayed away from me most of the time, spending many hours by himself practicing on Howie's banjo. One day on the grounds, a small group of people gathered around him as he sang and accompanied himself on the banjo. They liked the picture, I think, of the slender boy singing and strumming out a simple run of chords. They liked it so much that Harris allowed Joey to roam around the carnival grounds with the banjo. He picked up a little store of nickels and dimes in that way, But he didn't talk to me about it. I had been sharp with him on too many occasions lately, and he left me to myself. I felt angry with everyone those days, with Joey for no reason, with Edward C. because I had an idea that he understood too well the secret I tried to guard, with Pete Harris for presuming to love Emily. Most of all, I was angry with Emily. She'd been tender and kind, and then had betrayed me by allowing an old man to call her endearing names, to give her the kind of gift I wanted to give to her. I felt ashamed of my feelings, but they were beyond the control of reason. The dancer named Florrie, who told me that her name was actually Florinda, took to stopping at my piano oftener when nobody else was around. She was not attractive, her eyes were watery looking, and her mouth was loose and gave her a vacant, stupid look. Sometimes she seemed to like me, although she was angry when I addressed her as ma'am. But whether she liked me or not was of no consequence to me. My only reason for a mild friendliness toward her was that both Edward C. and Pete Harris warned me against her. Something negative in me made me pretend to like her better than I did. Florinda teased me about my sober appearance. "Don't you ever smile about nothing, big fellow?" she asked one night. "Was there some law up north that kept big fellows like you from ever getting a smile on their mouths?" "There's nothing much to smile about, Florinda," I answered. "You come out with me some night after working hours, and I'll take you places where there's plenty of smiles. You got money in your pocket now. You can afford to treat yourself and me to some nice smile places." "I have to save my money," I answered shortly. "I've been hungry because I didn't have money. I don't believe in spending it in smile places." Florinda moved her shoulders in a gesture that repelled me. "I know what's eating you, you big fellow. It's the clown. I've seen you looking calf-eyed at her. Well, listen, kid. She's Pete Harris's woman. Don't get no big ideas. That clown belongs to Pete, so you better be a good boy and keep your eyes off her." I was icy toward Florinda after that, but she had her revenge, for her words haunted me. "She's Pete Harris's woman. That clown belongs to Pete." They were the words of a cheap, venomous woman. I knew, but I remembered the earrings. I remembered that Pete Harris had called Emily Hunn. For many nights, I no longer waited for Emily to come past and say good night. Deliberately, I left my post early sometimes, and though I paid for my rebuff to Emily with hours of sleeplessness and regret, the stubborn Grondowski part of me would settle for no other behavior. At breakfast, when Emily joined us, I was far on the other side of Joey and Edward C., so far away that I could only nod to her. I even talked to the Blegans in order to seem to get to be preoccupied for a morning conversation with her. And the Blegans repaid me with more gossip. Had I heard that Pete Harris was soon to marry his clown? Oh, what a fool Pete Harris was to take on 3 red-headed brats for the privilege of marrying a red-headed clown. This from the Blegans. One night I waited for her. She was alone, the children having been put to bed earlier by Edward C. She came up to the piano as she had in the weeks before Christmas. "Good night, Josh," she said quietly, and started to walk on without saying anything more. I jumped up from the piano bench and went to her side. "May I walk home with you?" I asked. She was very grave. "Yes, of course," she answered. "I haven't talked with you for a long time." When we reached her doorstep, she sat down and faced me. "Well, Josh," she said finally. "How can you do it, Emily?" I asked desperately. "Do what?" she asked. "You know very well. How can you marry Pete Harris? How can you do a thing like that?" She was silent for a long time. Then she reached over and took my hand. I felt myself go weak while my hand rested in hers. "Josh, once, many years ago, I loved someone who didn't even know that I existed. I loved him so much, and I hated the girl he loved, a girl older and more sophisticated than I was. I suffered in those awful weeks before they were married. But the days and months smoothed things out for me. To tell you the truth, I have almost forgotten what he was like or why I loved him. But I know my love was sharp and hurtful while it lasted. I feel sorry for the little Emily I was then, and for the agony that she went through." "Yes, what are you trying to tell me?" "I don't know," she drew a long breath. "I'm not sure what I want to tell you. I'm just saying what's in my mind at the moment." "This is in my mind, Emily. People are saying that you are Pete Harris's woman. Is that right?" "There's a hate quality about that statement that makes me suspect it came from Florinda or the Blegans, or both." She took her hands away from mine and clasped them in her lap. No, I am not Pete Harris's woman in the sense that they say it, but I am going to marry Pete. And you must listen to me, Josh. I have to tell you a few things. She looked out into the night as she spoke, and at first her voice sounded colder than I'd ever heard it. But after a minute it warmed, and she was Emily again. Pete is a good man. He's not handsome or well educated or polished. He's not rich. He's never likely to be rich because he cares too much for everyone who has too little. Pete's not what is called a catch, but he's loyal and kind and decent. He knew my husband and me here in Baton Rouge several years ago, and when Carl was dying, Pete was like an older brother to him. When my boys and I were left terribly poor, he created a job for me here in the carnival, a job for which I had no training. He has looked after us and protected us. Isn't that enough? Does he need any higher credentials? But he's an old man, I said bitterly. He's too old for you. Pete's 45, Josh. That's 15 years older than I am. And I'm that much older than you are. 15 years doesn't matter awfully when you care for one another, does it? I didn't even answer for a long time. Finally, I muttered, all right, just forget you ever knew me. We'll be strangers from now on. She didn't move as I got up to walk away, but she spoke, and although her words were very low, I heard every word. She said, there are so many things that make life hurtful these days, Josh. If we're to be strangers, that is just one more painful thing. But if that's it, I'll have to accept it. I hope you'll change your mind. I left without answering her, and I lay awake for most of the night, miserable at having hurt her. But the memory of her defense of Pete Harris was a bitterness as great as my misery. The next morning, as we walked to breakfast, I noticed that Edward C. was looking at me with unusual kindness. Edward C. was a wise little man. I was sure he knew much more about me than I ever told him. When I mentioned that I was going to take a place at another table because I wanted to speak to the former bank teller about something, Edward C. nodded and made no comment. As a matter of fact, I hardly knew the former bank teller, and after we had exchanged nods, we ate our breakfast in complete silence. I didn't look across the room to the place where Joey and Edward C. welcomed Emily. Joey waited for me after the two others had walked on toward the dressing room tents. You hurt Emily's feelings this morning, Josh, he told me, and Edward sees too. I don't know how you can do a thing like that. You mind your business, Joey. I'll take care of mine. I answered. I didn't want to say that, but the words were out, and there was no recalling them. Joey didn't reply, but he looked at me directly in the eye, and the expression on his face was not that of the adoring little brother anymore. There was a cold, critical look in his eyes. I had a feeling that if I had wanted to fight, Joey would have fought right back. The weather that day was chillier than it had been since we reached Louisiana. The radio told about blizzards and sub-zero temperatures back home, and all through the northern part of the nation. Fringes of that cold had apparently moved down to us, and the people unaccustomed to the chill winds were miserable. Dozens of children were scuttling along the railroad tracks to try to pick up bits of coal and wood for fires in the boxcar homes. In the carnival tents, lights were left burning to provide a little warmth. The carnival crowd had dwindled to almost nothing during the day. The dancers didn't even bother to put on their act in the evening after a whole day of facing empty chairs in front of their pavilion. Freed of my duties for the night, I wandered beyond the meadow where the carnival lay, walking on and on with the hope that I'd get so tired I could go right to sleep when I returned to our tent. But long after weariness had worked down to bone depth, I sat leaning against a tall pine by the side of the road, facing my loneliness. I should have been used to the feeling. It had been with me for many weeks, but never quite so heavy as it was that night. I sat there remembering Mom and Kitty, remembering Howie and Miss Crown. I wanted to see Lonnie again. I wanted so much to talk to him, and amazingly enough, for a brief flash, I wanted the dad I had once known. Most of all, I wanted someone near me who was tender and sweet, someone who was Emily, but a 15-year-old Emily who would wear the earrings I would give her and would sit close beside me while I played music that would tell her of my love. The wind made a little sighing sound in the branches above me. I hated the wind. A bright morning, a moonlit night, a sunset sky, these might fill me with the hope for happier times. Not the wind. It either lashed or cried or whispered little mysteries known only to itself. The wind never gave me hope. It never made any promises. I buried my head in my arms for a while. It was late when I started back toward the carnival grounds. There was a glow in the sky above the grounds, the glow of the carnival lights. I thought at first, but then I realized that the light did not flash and sparkle in a pattern of colors. It was like a purplish red cloud hovering over the grounds, and it looked ominous. I felt troubled and I began to run. Then I heard the noises of sirens and trucks. I smelled the bitter smell of burning canvas and leather and celluloid and oil. The carnival was in wild confusion when I got there. Fire trucks, police cars, and an ambulance were on the ground. And everywhere there were people with drawn white faces, their eyes reddened by smoke and tears. Half the tents were charred or in ashes. The merry-go-round stood and silent in the midst of ruin. Some of its gaily painted horses blackened with smoke. The cars that made up the giant caterpillar with so many children had loved were collapsed and smoldering. My piano was a distorted shell, and the dancers' pavilion was gone. I found Joey with Emily and her boys and Edward C. They stood together outside Emily's boxcar, silent and almost unmoving, or so it seemed to me. The children showed signs of crying. The faces of Emily and Edward C. were full of despair. They told me what had happened. An oil heater had been left burning in one of the tents. Something caught fire. No one knew how, but the wind had blown fragments of burning canvas from one tent to another, from one set of flimsy toys to a dressing tent where frills and ruffles flamed as readily as a box of matches. Joey had saved the banjo and our few belongings when he saw the fire spreading, but the tent where we had slept was a mass of red coals on the ground. Pete was planning to move the carnival farther south in a few weeks, Emily said. Now there's little left to move. I don't know whether he can build another show or not. I can't bear to ask him. Florinda walked up the steps where we were standing. Her face was swollen with crying, and she stepped stiffly, like a person walking in his sleep. Her voice was shrill when she spoke to us. What's going to become of us? Answer me, Emily, answer me. Edward C. What's going to happen to us? What are we going to do now? We'll do whatever we can, Florinda, Emily answered. Maybe we'll scrub floors. There are still people left who can afford to pay for having their floors scrubbed. Maybe we'll scrub clothes over a washboard. We'll do whatever we have to do. But I'm a dancer, Florinda almost screamed. No one said anything, and that apparently frightened and enraged her. All right, I know what you're thinking. You're thinking that I've passed my best years. You're thinking that my legs are lumpy and that nobody will hire me, that I'm too old to get another job. Well, maybe that's true. This punk, she turned on me, this kid calling me ma'am, trying to make me feel 100. All right, punk, so I'm getting old, so I don't have Pete Harris to look after me the way your clown does. She stopped in the middle of her tirade and commenced to cry. I've never done a thing in my life except dance in the carnivals, and now my legs are lumpy, and I'm getting too old for the job. What am I going to do? Emily closed her eyes for a second and pressed her hands against her temples. Then she knelt on the step and drew Florinda down beside her. The rest of us walked a little distance away. Florinda left after about a half hour or so, and Emily went inside the car where she made cocoa for the children and coffee for the rest of us. Her face was different. It was ashy white and set in stern, hard lines. She didn't smile as she handed our cups to us. The terror of the fire, the hysteria of Florinda, the fear and anxiety that had struck all of us, had made a stranger of Emily. She sat drinking her coffee and staring at the ruin before us. Edward C. put his small hand on hers once to remind her, I guess, of his presence and affection. She nodded in acknowledgment of his gesture, but that was all. Then, as we all sat together, grim and unhappy, Pete Harris came striding down the tracks and ran up the steps of the car. The room was dimly lighted, and I didn't recognize him at first, but Emily did. She ran to him and hid her face against his shoulder. He put his arms around her and held her close to him. I heard her say, "It's going to be all right, hun. We'll make it back. I promise you, we'll make it back. As long as I have you and the boys, I'm not scared about a comeback." I watched them, and they were like two people far removed from me. Pete Harris was kind. He was gentle with Emily, and that was right. And Emily, I knew finally that she could never have been the 15-year-old Emily I had dreamed about. Never. She was a woman nearer my mother's age than mine, but she had been kind. When I needed understanding most, Emily had been understanding. That was the way I would remember her, except once in a while, perhaps, when I'd see a beautiful woman wearing earrings of a certain red gold color. And then I knew. I'd remember a time when love was new and bewildering and bitterly sweet.